All right, so we're going to talk about monetary policy here, how it works, what it stimulates, and then we're going to talk about fiscal policy, and then we're going to compare the two a little bit more. So we're not going to be completely done with it, but essentially, monetary policy is controlled by the Bank of Canada, whereas fiscal policy is controlled by the government. Because fiscal policy, you could think about government spending, budgets, taxes, whereas monetary policy, we're thinking about influencing the money supply, interest rates to achieve a certain goal of inflation. And this is all governed by the Bank of Canada. Even though it's a federal institution, it's not Conservatives or Liberal or NDP. It's like I mentioned before, the governor's on a 7-year term, and it's managed separately. They can have similar goals. So we'll just talk about all of that a little bit here. So what's the monetary policy definition? It is the process by which the monetary authority of a country, the central bank, like the central bank or currency board, controls the supply of money, often targeting an inflation rate or interest rate to ensure price stability and general trust in the currency. So inflation rate is really the target of the Bank of Canada. Like we mentioned before, it's that 1 to 3% inflation with the target being 2%. That is what they target. That's their goal. That's their main goal of the Bank of Canada. If you go on their website, that's what you'll see. And what that does is it gives trust to people in the currency, because essentially the currency is not being devalued more than this at this rate on a yearly basis, compared to a country that has hyperinflation, where that devaluation process would happen very rapidly. I find this a little bit targeting an interest rate. We don't really target an interest rate. Targeting the interest rate is the tool used to make sure that this inflation rate is on check. So how does monetary policy work? So we just saw in the previous section that drops in money supply leads to increases in interest rates, or increase in interest rates leads to drop in money supply, or the opposite here. If we start with here, this is an example of an expansionary monetary policy. So if you're wondering if it's expansionary or contractionary, well, if it in the end of things it expands aggregate demand, it's expansionary. And if it contracts monetary aggregate demand, then it's a contractionary policy. So here an expansionary monetary policy is where we have an increase in money supply, but since they move in opposite directions, it's a decrease in interest rates. So even though it's an expansionary monetary policy, interest rates fall. So not everything expands. So an increase in money supply leads to an excess supply of money, which leads to an interest rate drop, or you start from here and the rest just follows through. As I mentioned, we could either start by changing the money supply, or start by changing interest rates, and the rest will follow. This typically, the investment impact, or the interest rate or the investment rate channel will say that through this process, investment will increase and aggregate demand will go up. But as we'll note later on when we talk about Keynesian versus monetarists, some people will argue that investment may be insensitive, non-sensitive to changes in the interest rate. If investment is insensitive to changes in interest rate, you're doing this policy of increasing money supply, dropping interest rate. But if investment, and let's say even consumption, is insensitive to interest rates, you're like, well, we did this, but it hasn't stimulated aggregate demand to no extent. So no increase in investment from a change in R would be the case if it's insensitive. But typically we'd expect some level of change. So if nothing changes, you're like, whoa, this monetary policy in this case is not very good. So as I was mentioning before, comparing monetary and fiscal policy, in that case you would say monetary policy is not the right thing if it can't stimulate investment. Well, 1 second, there's another channel that we want to look at, but at the same time, if it's not going to stimulate investment a lot, because we saw investment is also not only changes in investment aren't only due to changes in interest rates, there's also changes in general business conditions or industry conditions. You might want to improve the overall perception of the economy first, because otherwise you might not have that much of an impact. But here's the other channel, the exchange rate channel. The exchange rate channel will say that a drop in interest rate will change the nominal exchange rate. Because if we go back to the open economy example, a drop in interest rate will lead to more net capital outflows. Net capital outflows, money will start flowing elsewhere where they pay a higher interest rate. Therefore, the value of our currency will depreciate. And you'll be able to notice this. And at the same time, I've gone through this process in other classrooms in the past. You'll be able to notice this in practice because interest rates are modified like 8 times per year in Canada. And if they're modified and people were expecting it, the day of the announcement, exchange rates won't change that much. But as was the case once in the past, if half the people at least, or half the economists and everyone else, believe that the Bank of Canada is going to announce an interest rate hike, so the exchange rate takes into account this information, and at the last minute, when it's the day of the announcement, they announce that no, there's not going to be an interest rate hike, or there's going to be a decrease. While compared to the expectations, the interest rate is lower. And one of the times I taught this class, we saw that because of this, the value of the currency dropped because people didn't expect it. They expected it to be higher. It was lower. So it's similar as saying, sorry about that, similar as saying that the interest rates are lower, which made the currency depreciate. And we know that when the Canadian dollar will depreciate, well, over time, a lower value of a currency will lead to more exports and less imports. Net exports will go up, which makes sense. If net capital outflows go up, net exports is equal to net capital outflow, so it must also go up. So even if investment is insensitive to change in interest rate, a drop in interest rate can still stimulate aggregate demand through the exchange rate channel. So that's one of the big things to consider here in monetary policy. Both channels are important. If ever you have a question on an exam that asks what are the transmission mechanisms of monetary policy, think about kind of this sweet sequence. It's not just a drop in interest rate that increases aggregate demand. There's certain steps in between. So drop in interest rate leads to the currency to depreciate, leads to exports going up, imports going down, leads to increasing aggregate demand. Or in the previous case, drop in interest rates leads to more investment, leads to greater aggregate demand. That's the transmission mechanism kind of idea, how one change can transmit further on. And if there's a blockage in the process, like investment being insensitive to changes in interest rate, well, then that channel doesn't get to the aggregate demand change. So that transmission mechanism is kind of interrupted. One of the things to keep in mind is if the Bank of Canada, its main goal is to try to control inflation. So something I've been hearing in the news recently, but when you'll watch this video, it won't really be in the news, the fresh news, but you might be in a situation where monetary policy is not used to restore the economy to potential output following a recessionary output gap because you're trying to control inflation. So in this case here, actually what's going on right now is that the economy is recovering from this last recession, so things are going better. But the problem is that, and we'll see in the next slide, is when we're going through a recession, the reason that we want to stimulate the economy from the Bank of Canada's perspective is when we have a recession, the price level either stays stable or starts going down. And that can't be the case because they want the price level to go at this 1 to 3% target inflation rate. So they want it to go up by a certain amount on a yearly basis. So the problem may arise is towards the end of a recession, when the economy is starting to recuperate, it might not be at full employment yet, but if there's signs that we're reaching that 2% target, and if we let interest rates stay low for a long time, it's going to surpass this range. They're going to start increasing interest rates even though the economy hasn't fully recovered to avoid inflation getting out of hand in the future. The thing to keep in mind in this process is a lot of people say that a change in interest rates takes roughly 1 year to have an impact on investment and GDP. So 1 year to have an impact on production. But it takes 1 to 2 years to have an impact on inflation. So the people working at the Bank of Canada really have to be looking in that crystal ball and thinking, okay, the economy is not fully recovered. We don't want to slow it down yet. But if we let the interest rates stay low for too long, it's going to overheat. And then in the next few years, we're going to be suffering from inflation that's greater than 3% or even greater than 2%. And we don't want that to happen. But the other problem that they're looking at is, well, if we increase interest rates too fast, we might halt, we might stop this growth of the economy, and it might just stop all of a sudden, and then we're going to have like 0% inflation, which is something they don't want either. So it's a very hard, tricky situation. It's just something to keep in mind. So how does the central bank react to output gaps? Well, they want to keep, this term here is inflation on target. So what they want to do is they want to keep real GDP as close as possible to potential output to avoid price pressures. So if you have positive or negative demand shocks, they'll meet it with expansionary or contractionary monetary policies. This is pretty simple if we think about that whole idea of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply. Well, obviously, if there's negative aggregate demand, they're going to want to bounce it back up to return to that initial point where we have roughly the same price level or the same price level trend of like a 2% increase per year. That's easy. So negative demand shock, positive or expansionary monetary policy. Positive demand shock, contractionary monetary policy. What's harder, as was mentioned before, is if we have a negative supply shock. Well, then we're in a situation that if they decide to stimulate the economy, we're going to have a lot of inflation. So in those instances, it's still a less than potential output situation, that stagflation situation. But from a Bank of Canada central bank perspective with an inflation target, it's very hard for them in that sense to intervene. Because Bank of Canada's goal, inflation stability, money stability. Fiscal policy goal is slightly different because the government just thinks more about employment, lets the Bank of Canada think more about actual inflation. So we're going to move on to fiscal policy in this next video.